For one day in 1962, the fate of the world came down to just one man, Soviet naval officer Vasily Arkhipov. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the United States and the Soviet Union ever came to full-scale nuclear war. A 13-day standoff that kicked off after a U-2 spy plane discovered that Russia was installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from America's shores. The most terrifying of those 13 days was October the 27th, the day the Russians shot down another U-2, killing its pilot. But that's not the incident I'm referring to. The world would not know just how close it came to disaster until decades later. President John F. Kennedy ordered a quarantine of Cuba in a show of force meant to blockade the Russians and intimidate them into removing the Caribbean missiles. The U.S. deployed an aircraft carrier and 11 destroyers. The Russians sent 4 Foxtrot-class diesel submarines. The 36-year-old Vasily Arkhipov was the executive officer on one of those submarines, the B-59. The B-59 and its cohorts had been staying deep to avoid revealing themselves to the Americans. They hadn't had any communication with Moscow in days, and the only thing they knew about what might be going on above them was from intercepted U.S. civilian radio news reports when they'd arrived several days earlier. Those news reports painted the immediate future in very bleak terms. The American Navy managed to locate the B-59, and even though they were in international waters, decided to force the sub to the surface by dropping signaling depth charges. These were low-yield explosive devices that were not capable of damaging the sub, but were instead meant to communicate that the ship firing them was aware of the submarine's presence. The B-59's captain, convinced that war had already broken out, decided to fire a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo, which almost certainly would have vaporized much of the American fleet, killing thousands of sailors. But the decision was not the captain's alone. It required the authorization of 2 other officers: the political officer, the position responsible for ensuring the crew didn't deviate from Soviet dogma, and the executive officer, Arkhipov. The political officer agreed with the captain and voted to fire the weapon. Only Arkhipov kept his head and opposed the launch. He was a quiet, mild-mannered man who had a sterling reputation in the Soviet Navy, especially after his courageous actions a year earlier when the nuclear sub to which he was assigned, the K-19, nearly suffered a reactor meltdown. That story was dramatized in Kathryn Bigelow's 2002 film K-19, The Widowmaker, starring Harrison Ford and Liam Neeson. Arkhipov managed to convince his superiors that while surfacing certainly put their lives at risk, the alternative, should they be wrong, would mean the death of millions, setting off a major global thermonuclear response that would destroy much of the Northern Hemisphere. As the B-59 surfaced, U.S. fighter planes strafed the water beside it with warning shots. The sub's captain briefly made contact with the enemy fleet before heading away from Cuba and back toward the Soviet Union. The close call sobered leaders on both sides of the skirmish, and the Russians withdrew their missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. removed theirs from Turkey. A nearly sizzling thermonuclear hot war returned to being cold once again. The crew of the B-59 arrived home in disgrace. Many of their superiors angrily claimed that they should have gone down fighting. Somehow, Arkhipov weathered the storm and ended his career in the mid-1980s as a 2-star admiral. He died of kidney cancer in 1998, likely due to the radiation that he and others aboard the K-19 faced while trying to get the failing reactor under control. Dozens of his former shipmates had already died of radiation poisoning. At the time, his actions during the Cuban Missile Crisis were not widely known. They were only disclosed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it's only been in recent years that his heroics have been recognized. The historian and presidential advisor, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., stated that, quote, "This was not only the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in human history." In 2002, Thomas Blanton, former director of the U.S. National Security Archive, said Arkhipov was, quote, "the man who saved the world." Stay curious, my friends.